Imagine a world without color. Not completely black and white, but close. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth was covered in endless shades of green. Deep green, pale green, soft olive tones stretching across the land as far as the eye could see. There were forests, yes, but not the kind we know today. No flowers, no bright petals, no drifting sweetness in the air. Instead, the world was ruled by ancient plants. Towering ferns rose high above the ground, their long fronds spreading out like giant feathers. Thick, upright club mosses stood like living pillars, their surfaces covered in tiny, tightly packed leaves, and everywhere tall horsetails grew in clusters. Their hollow stems divided into repeating segments almost like natural bamboo. Beneath all of this, the ground was soft. A dense carpet of moss and liverworts covered the soil, holding moisture like a sponge. If you stepped there, it would feel damp, almost alive. It was a world full of life. But strangely, it felt quiet. Not silent in sound, but silent in expression. Everything looked similar. Layer upon layer of green with almost no contrast. No color to catch the eye. No scent to carry through the wind. No nectar to attract movement. And maybe that's the part we rarely think about. Today, flowers don't just exist and they call out. They use color. They use smell. They invite. But back then, nothing was calling. For nearly 90% of the history of land plants, the idea of a flower simply did not exist. Let that sink in for a moment. All the roses, lilies, sunflowers, fruit trees, everything we associate with beauty or even food today, none of it was there. Not yet. Then something changed. Not suddenly in the way we usually imagine change, but in evolutionary terms, it happened surprisingly fast. A new kind of structure appeared. Small, delicate, easy to overlook, but it carried something completely new. It didn't just grow. It protected, it organized, it interacted, and that quiet innovation would go on to reshape the entire planet. It would change how plants reproduce, how ecosystems form, and eventually, how humans live. Because without that change, there would be no fruits, no grains, no agriculture, no civilizations built on fields of crops. But here's the strange part. Even though this change was so important, we still don't fully know how it began. The first flower is like a ghost, something that must have existed, something that changed everything. But something no one has ever truly seen. So how do you study something like that? How do you understand a moment that left almost no clear trace behind? To even begin answering that, we have to travel far back in time, more than 140 million years ago, to a period known as the early Cretaceous. The Earth at that time looked very different. The massive supercontinent that once held all land together was slowly breaking apart. Huge land masses drifted away from each other, forming new oceans, new climates, new environments. The world was changing from the ground up. And above that shifting land, giant creatures walked. Dinosaurs were at their peak. Some moved in herds across open plains. Others lived deep within forests. They dominated the landscape in size, in presence, and in power. But beneath their feet, something much quieter was happening. While the giants lived out their lives generation after generation, plants were experimenting, trying new structures, new strategies, new ways to survive. And somewhere in that quiet process, the first true flower began to take shape. For a long time, this moment confused even the greatest scientific minds. Charles Darwin himself gave it a name. He called it an abominable mystery, not because flowers were strange, but because of how they appeared. When scientists looked at the fossil record, they expected to see a slow transition, step by step, simple to complex, a gradual build-up towards something like a flower. But that's not what they found. Instead, flowering plants seemed to appear almost suddenly. Already diverse, already developed, already spread across different environments. It was as if nature had skipped steps or hidden them. And that gap became one of the greatest puzzles in science. So researchers began searching, not in one place, but everywhere. They studied ancient lake beds, where fine sediments could preserve delicate plant impressions. They examined clay deposits where time had compressed layers of life into stone. They traveled across continents, looking for even the smallest trace, a leaf, a stem, a pattern, anything that might hint at the origin of flowers. Because somewhere out there had to be a clue. And eventually one of those clues appeared. In northeastern China, buried within layers of ancient rock, scientists discovered something unusual, a fossil unlike most others found before it. They named it Archifructus. At first glance, it didn't look impressive. In fact, it didn't even look like a flower. No petals, no bright shapes, no symmetry that stood out. It looked more like a simple water plant. Thin, fragile, with a long, narrow stem and small structures along its sides. If you saw it without context, you might not think much of it, just another ancient plant. But sometimes, the most important details are the easiest to miss, because when scientists looked closer, much closer, they began to notice something different, something subtle, but incredibly important. And that small detail would slowly change how we understand the origin of every flower on Earth. So what exactly did they see, hidden inside that simple, almost unremarkable plant? When scientists looked more closely, they began to notice something important. The seeds of this plant were no longer fully exposed. They were enclosed inside a protective structure. It might sound like a small detail, but in reality, it was a major step forward. Before this, many ancient plants had what we could call naked seeds, exposed to the environment. If the sun was too harsh, they dried out. If the wind was too strong, they were lost. If conditions weren't right, they simply didn't survive. But now, there was protection, a layer surrounding something fragile, almost like the first shelter ever built around a living thing. And that changed everything. With better protection, seeds had a higher chance of surviving, and with higher survival, plants could begin to spread more effectively. This feature became the defining trait of an entirely new group of plants with enclosed seeds. So you might be wondering, does that mean Archifructus was the very first flower? The answer isn't so simple. As remarkable as it is, many scientists believe it wasn't the original. It lived in shallow water, a very specific environment, and that detail matters because it suggests something important. This plant had already adapted over a long period of time, possibly millions of years. In other words, Archifructus may not be the beginning of the story. It may already be part of a later chapter. So where is the true first flower? That question pushed scientists to look even further, not just into the ground, but into living plants themselves. It might sound surprising, but it makes sense. Instead of relying only on fossils, researchers began studying tens of thousands of modern flowering plants. They compared their shapes, their structures, and even their genetic information. Then using computer models, they worked backward, like building a massive family tree, and tracing it all the way to its root. One major effort in this direction is a project called eFlower. Its goal is simple, at least in theory, to reconstruct the original blueprint of the first flower. And what they found was unexpected. The first flower, according to these models, was not large, not colorful, not eye-catching. It was likely a small woody shrub, living quietly in ancient tropical forests, not in open sunlight, but beneath dense layers of vegetation, a place where light barely reached, where the air was dim and still. Its flower was simple, balanced in shape, almost perfectly radial. If you imagined slicing it like a pie, each section would look nearly the same. Instead of distinct petals, it likely had layers of petal-like structures, arranged in neat circles around the center. These structures were probably pale, white or slightly off-white. Bright colors like red or blue likely hadn't evolved yet. There's another interesting detail. This flower likely had both male and female parts in the same structure. It may seem ordinary now, but back then, it was a huge advantage because flowering plants were still rare, scattered. So when an insect visited, even just once, that single visit could be enough. to give pollen and receive it. Efficient, simple, but incredibly effective. Which brings up an important question. Who were these first visitors? When we think of flowers today, we often think of bees. But bees didn't exist yet. The earliest visitors were likely beetles and small flies. They weren't attracted by sweet scents. Flowers hadn't developed those yet. Instead, they were drawn to pollen, rich in nutrients, or perhaps to a safe place to lay their eggs. This early relationship was not graceful. There was no precision, no specialization, just clumsy encounters, almost accidental, sometimes even destructive. Beetles would
damage parts of the flower.
And because of that, early flowers couldn't be too delicate. They had to be tougher, thicker. Their structures became more solid, more resistant. Not beautiful in the way we think today, but necessary, because from these rough beginnings, a connection was forming between plants and insects. At first it was случайный, unintentional, but over time, it would become one of the most powerful relationships in nature. And from that point on, the story of flowers would begin to change in a completely new way. So how did this fragile, accidental interaction turn into the rich, colorful world of flowers we see today? But the story doesn't end with the appearance of the first flower, because the world it was born into wasn't easy. Plants weren't starting from nothing. In fact, Earth was already full of other plant life, especially one major group, plants with seeds, but no flowers. Today, we still see their descendants, pine trees, cycads, ginkgo. They had been around long before flowers ever appeared. And at that time, they dominated the landscape. Their method of reproduction was simple. They relied on the wind. They produced huge amounts of pollen, light, dust-like. The wind would carry it everywhere. And if they were lucky, a few grains would land in the right place. It worked. But it was inefficient. Most of that pollen was wasted, drifting endlessly, never reaching its target. It was a numbers game. The more you made, the better your chances. Then flowers appeared, and they introduced a completely different approach. Instead of sending pollen out blindly into the air, they began to use animals. An insect would move from one flower to another, carrying pollen with it. No need for massive quantities, just accuracy. And that small shift made a huge difference. Flowering plants no longer needed to grow in dense clusters. They could live farther apart, in smaller, more isolated spaces, and still reproduce successfully. That efficiency became their advantage. And over time, that advantage began to show. As climates shifted, as continents continued to drift, as environments became more diverse, flowering plants began to move out of the shadows. Slowly at first, then faster. They spread into open spaces, into sunlight, and once they did, diversity exploded. Some remained small, staying close to water. Others grew taller, becoming part of the forest canopy. And some developed something entirely new. Fruits. It sounds familiar now, but back then, it was a major innovation. Instead of letting seeds simply fall to the ground, plants began to partner with animals. Animals would eat the fruit, travel, and release the seed somewhere else. A highly effective way to spread. And as large creatures like dinosaurs and early mammals moved across the land, they unknowingly carried these plants with them. Little by little, flowering plants expanded their reach. But here's an interesting question. If the first flower started at all, where is it now? Why don't we see it growing today? The answer lies in evolution itself. The very traits that made it successful also led to its disappearance. Over time, flowers became more specialized. Some evolved scent to attract specific insects. Others developed bright colors. Others took on unique shapes, each one adapting to a particular kind of visitor. And in that process, the original, more general form became less competitive. It was slowly replaced, not by something unrelated, but by its own descendants. Newer versions, better adapted to a changing world. And so, the original form faded, but not entirely. A few traces still remain. One of them is a plant called ambarella. It grows in only one place, a small island in the South Pacific. At first glance, there's nothing remarkable about it. A small shrub, tiny flowers, greenish yellow in color, no true petals, very ordinary. But inside, it holds something extraordinary. Genetic studies show that it branched off very early, near the base of the flowering plant family tree. In other words, it's the closest living relative we have to the first flower. It grows in moist, shaded mountain forests, very similar to the environment where its ancestors once lived. Studying it is like looking at an old photograph. Not perfectly clear, not complete, but enough to understand where everything began. And as the story continues, the impact of that first flower becomes even more visible. It didn't just change the look of the landscape, it changed how the planet works. Flowering plants tend to grow faster. They move water through ecosystems more efficiently. The air becomes more humid. New environments begin to form. Rainforests, like the ones we see today, start to emerge. And if you look closely, you'll realize something. All of these changes trace back to something very small, a single flower. And yet, that raises an even bigger question. If flowers could transform the entire planet like this, how did they continue to evolve into the rich, colorful world we see today? As flowering plants began to spread, something important started to happen. They didn't just change how plants reproduced. They began to reshape the entire food chain. The seeds and fruits they produced weren't just for reproduction anymore. They became a new source of energy, abundant, accessible, rich in nutrients. And that opened the door for other forms of life. Birds, mammals, creatures that began to adapt, to take advantage of this new resource, eating seeds, eating fruit. Over time, they began to change. Beaks evolved, teeth evolved, behavior evolved. A new relationship formed between plants and animals. Without that first flower, the world might look very different. No vast grasslands, no orchards of fruit, no fields of grain to sustain human life, and maybe even our own history would have taken a different path. There's something else too. The way we see the world may be connected to flowers. Human color vision, our ability to distinguish subtle differences in color, may have evolved in part to help our primate ancestors find ripe fruit or young leaves hidden within dense green canopies. A small detail, but deeply connected to how we live today. But the story of flowers is not just about growth. It is also a story of survival. About 66 million years ago, something catastrophic happened. A massive asteroid struck the Earth. The impact changed everything. Dust and soot filled the atmosphere, blocking sunlight. For years, the world grew darker, colder. Many species could not survive. Non-avian dinosaurs disappeared, and countless other forms of life were lost. Plants were affected too. Many could not endure the prolonged darkness and cold, but flowering plants had an advantage, something easy to overlook: the seed. Many seeds of flowering plants can remain dormant, hidden in the soil, not growing, not dying, just waiting for the right conditions to return. And when the skies finally cleared and sunlight reached the alard again, those seeds began to awaken. They sprouted, and life returned. Flowering plants were among the first to recover. They spread quickly across the damaged land, filling empty spaces left behind by extinct species. And once again, they diversified more rapidly, more widely, eventually giving rise to the hundreds of thousands of species we see today, from tough desert cacti to delicate water lilies, each one carrying a trace of that distant past, a memory of the very first flower. When we look at a flower today, we are seeing the result of millions of years of trial and error. Some flowers are shaped perfectly to match the beak of a specific bird. Others produce scents that mimic decaying matter to attract certain insects. It may seem strange, but every detail serves a purpose. What we see as beauty is also survival. The first flower was probably not beautiful in the way we think of beauty today, not like a rose, not like a sunflower. It was likely small, subtle, trying to survive. in a world dominated by giants, but its importance is impossible to overstate. It marked a shift from passive to active, from relying on the randomness of the wind to forming direct relationships with living creatures. We may never find the exact fossil of that very first flower, but what we have discovered is enough. Enough to understand the world it lived in, the creatures that visited it, the small changes it carried within itself. It was an experiment of nature, and one that succeeded beyond anything we could have imagined. Its disappearance was not a failure. It was a transformation, because in truth, it never really vanished. It's still here. In every piece of fruit we eat, in every breath we take, and in every splash of color that breaks the endless green of the natural world. The first flower reminds us of something simple. The biggest changes often begin with something very small, quiet, almost unnoticed. If you look at the long timeline of Earth, the age of flowers is actually quite short, and yet it is the era that shaped the world we live in. Today, as we continue to discover fossils and decode plant DNA, the image of the first flower is becoming clearer. It feels like a bridge connecting two very different worlds. On one side, the ancient Earth, strange, a place where dinosaurs once lived. On the other, the world we know today, full of color, full of life. When we look at its reconstructed form, it feels like we are witnessing a very special moment, the moment when Earth began to wake up, slowly, gently, moving toward the diversity we see today. That flower was not just a plant. It was proof of adaptation, of resilience, a form of life that keeps finding ways to survive, to grow, even in the shadows. The first flower may be long gone, but its traces are still everywhere. In every ecosystem, in every forest, in every small garden, it exists as a silent witness to the long journey of life on Earth. And when we understand that story, we begin to see nature differently. The plants around us are no longer just background scenery. They are descendants of an ancestor that changed everything. Trying to understand the first flower is not just science. It is also a way to understand ourselves, to understand where we come from, and the connections that link all life together. Every time we look at a flower, we are looking at a link in a very long chain, stretching back to the beginning of the modern world. The first flower may be gone, but its spirit is still here. In every garden, every field, every forest, a quiet reminder of the moment when the world first learned how to bloom. In the silence of ancient forests, that first flower held a blueprint for the future. A future that would one day include us. And as we piece together what it looked like and how it lived, we are also honoring the journey of evolution, a long journey, quiet, but never still. The first flower was like a spark, small, but powerful enough to ignite something vast, a fire of biodiversity, burning for over 100 million years. And even now, it continues.